Welcome to the first ever episode of Musicians versus the World. This is a podcast for musicians, those hoping to become musicians, or those that honestly just love music and want to learn a little bit more about it and about the day-to-day lives of the people that make it. I'm Christine Smith. I'm your host. I am a musician, which means I do a lot of everything. I've performed, I've done solo recitals, played in garage bands to orchestras, on small ensembles, theater pits, choirs, weddings, parties, commercials, indie films. I am also a teacher, and I've done a little bit of composing, a little bit of conducting, and a little bit of adjudicating. So I'm pretty much your typical run-of-the-mill musician next door. And over the past 20 years of my career, I've met a lot of really interesting people. And I'm always fascinated by their stories and the lessons that they've learned along their path to becoming a quote-unquote musician. So I started this podcast to share their stories, as well as to talk about the day-to-day issues and things that might be helpful to other musicians for support and also for education. When trying to decide the first topic to discuss on this podcast, I thought it would be best to start at the very beginning with a topic that is pretty universal for every single musician in the world, and that's auditions. Auditions are unavoidable for musicians. It is our interview process. It doesn't matter how well you network or how organized you are or how big your ego is. If you can't play your instrument or if you can't sing on key, you're never going to get hired anywhere. Auditions are a high-pressure situation that all musicians have to deal with. So now good teachers know this, and so we start exposing our students to auditions very early in their learning career. Luckily, there are plenty of low-stress, non-competitive auditions for music students, like Guild or Federation, Royal Conservatory of Music, ABRSM, and there's a lot of them. And they're very non-competitive, and they're positive experiences for students from the very beginning levels of study. We are going to have an episode all about those. So I'm not going to go into those, but what I want to talk about today are high-stakes auditions. These will be your competitions, college auditions, orchestral auditions. They're auditions that really, really have a direct and immediate effect on the career path of a professional musician. So this is actually a 3-part series looking at high-stakes auditions. So the first 2 episodes will be featuring concert pianist Dr. Scott Holden. In part 1, we'll be discussing how to win an audition from a performer's and judge's perspective. And then part 2 will cover repertoire choices and kind of more teaching strategies on how to help others prepare for these high-stakes auditions. And then in part 3, we'll be switching gears and we'll be speaking with Brian Blanchard from the Utah Symphony and his wife Madeline, who is also a musician and a horn player from the orchestra at Temple Square. And we'll be talking with them about auditions and career paths post-college. So let's just jump right into it. So today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Scott Holden from Brigham Young University. He is a professor of piano and head of keyboard division at Brigham Young University. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan, the Juilliard School, and the Manhattan School of Music, and he has a long list of accomplishments. He is a well sought-after concert pianist. He's performed in over 40 states, Canada, Mexico, England, Russia, all throughout Europe and Asia. He's been broadcast on NPR, NBC, CBC, as well as numerous local networks. And he has been gracious enough to speak with us over the phone today from his office at BYU. And I am just extremely grateful that he's agreed to talk with us today. And most importantly, he was my professor at school, and he was a mentor to me, and he helped me rekindle my love for music after I was suffering from a pretty bad burnout. And so I will be forever grateful to him and his guidance and his teaching me when I was at school. So Dr. Holden, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here. And that was my favorite part of your introduction. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, well, you're welcome. So before we get into all of your vast knowledge and expertise, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and about how you got into music and why you do what you do?
Sure. My story is probably very much like many other people's, just in the sense that I started, my mom was my first teacher. I was 6 and quickly progressed. And I think what really propelled me to want to go into music was in middle school, I had gone to Interlochen, which is a summer music program in Michigan. And I realized that the people I was with, I thought, these are my people, chance to make music during the day, go to concerts at night. And I just felt so comfortable. And that was a really life-changing event for me. And at that point, I decided that's what I wanted to do professionally.
And so now, knowing what you know now about music and about the profession and about all the nitty-gritty of it, would you do it all again? Would you go into music again?
Yeah, and I think here's the proof. It's that when I go on vacation, a couple of days is great. And then the third day, I think, what would be perfect on this vacation is if I had a piano for about the next 2.5 hours. So if I could just go practice some music, that would be the ideal vacation.
And auditions, I've got to tell you, were the worst part of my entire music learning experience.
Yes.
I'm sure you run into that a lot.
You know what? I'm 48, and I still have every couple of months an anxiety dream where I'm in some piano competition, and it usually looks like this. Wait, I have to play a Mozart concerto in the final round? Oh my goodness. I didn't realize that it's in 2 hours. We do our piano juries or our auditions, and we as faculty, we look at each other and we say, aren't we glad we don't have to do this anymore? Because it is really stressful. I completely understand.
You've been on juries, you have done a lot of auditions, and you've judged a lot of auditions and competitions. So I was hoping you could help us with some of your expertise.
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, it comes down to this. I always like to ask my students, what wins auditions? And the word win is a little bit dubious, I should say. But I think the thing that wins auditions is the intensity of the artistry. This means a few things. It means a balance of the two sides of really what your body needs to do. One is that you need to be kind of the racehorse, meaning energy, drive, drama, expressing with big conviction all those things that are in the score. And then there's the opposite side of that happening at the same time, which is being cool-headed, kind of the computer, so to speak, precise, and finding a balance of those two things is difficult. When we have our college auditions, these students have spent the majority of their life, maybe let's say they're 18, they've been doing this for, say, 12 years, and they get 10 or 15 minutes to show what they've done with their life. That's a kind of a terrible process. And yet, usually within a minute, you can often feel like how much we as, I hate to say this, but as a jury member want to engage listening. A lot of schools, as we do now, do a pre-screening. So this makes the level a little higher once we're hearing the live audition. But it's a very intense process. And I think there is definitely something that you can practice about doing this to make this as strong of a situation as possible.
What sort of things do you mean to practice?
Well, I really appreciate that a great god of the piano, Arthur Rubinstein, said that it took him 7 or 8 performances of any piece that was new for him till he started to feel like it was comfortable and he could play it well. I really enjoy knowing that kind of the piano deity are also human.
Yeah.
Because I have a very similar experience. I have to play something many times. So some of the things that would involve practicing would be, you'd be insane to go to an audition. And whether that means a college audition or just even like the end of year studio recital, something that's more low key, without having practiced performing a number of times that very piece, because there's always going to be potholes, and usually those first few performances, at least for me and most people, there's sometimes they're big potholes. So it's a chance to find out where there are weaknesses in my, in preparation, be it memory or musical. And I always recommend my students to record those things. Listening to yourself perform is it's a very objective and sometimes humbling experience. And usually it looks like this. You hear yourself and you think, I had no idea it was going so fast.
Yeah.
Because your brain, that racehorse part is sending out all this adrenaline. So you're going at kind of hyperdrive in your brain. So a number of performances before the big one is essential. And I think someone would be crazy not to do that. I think it's also important to have a mindset that it's hopefully a very positive experience, and that really when you're in a competition, you're competing against one person, and that is you're competing against the best version of yourself. And if you go with the mindset of, hey, I get to perform and create music, create art, this is very different than a very defensive mindset of like, don't screw up, or what if I have memory slips, or, any of these kinds of things that we all feel.
Yes, that was my problem. I would always get into that defensive mode every single time. How do you suggest to your students that they switch their mindset?
I like to ask them, what are the parts that they look forward to playing? What chord can you not wait to perform? Basically, kind of get back to that first moment when you hear a piece and you think, wow, I have to play that piece. What are the things that kind of made you fall in love with it? In the learning stage of any repertoire, it's like, imagine it's like taking a stopwatch apart on your kitchen table into 500 little tiny bits and gears, and then putting the whole thing back together, and coming back to a kind of second naivete, so to speak, coming back to knowing it for the first time, or hearing it for the first time. So looking forward to those kinds of things is important. I think it's really important in your preparation that you have very, very conscious choices about every phrase you're making, so that you can be thinking about those things the whole time and not thinking about those kinds of more difficult thoughts, like what if I screw this up? Here comes that hard part.
Yeah, here comes that B section. I actually was just thinking about this as you were talking about making it a positive experience. Is there a reason that a lot of times the judges are like scowling when you walk into a jury room?
What a great question. Yes, and I really appreciate you asking that. I'll tell you why, and it has nothing to do with the performers. Every time someone walks in, because I judge a lot of piano competitions in many places, and I'm really hoping that the next person who walks in will make my job really easy, and I'll think, that's the winner. They were so great. I'm just hoping this will be the one. They're scowling in part because they've been sitting there a long time and their hand is getting tired, or maybe they're running 20 minutes late, and it's making things very tight. It has nothing to do with the performer. I hope that we smile when we have our own auditions here, but I'm sure there's some times when we're not. I hope that every young pianist, well, who knows what the future will be, but I just wish that they could sit on the other side and be in a adjudicating panel, because I think it's very eye-opening. It helps very much to prepare pianists to be in auditions. But I think you also get to see the background, and that it's not a track meet necessarily, which I say is like an objective thing, meaning, this person ran faster than the other one, and it's very black and white. Sometimes there's a lot of gray areas. So there have been times when I felt really passionate about a particular performer. I felt that they were better, but maybe there were two other judges and they outvoted me, which is fine because they felt strong about someone else too. But sometimes I just want to take that person aside and say, hey, I thought you should have been the winner. I'm sorry you weren't. And sometimes I've even done that, but in general, I just will leave things to the comments and not generally make that kind of statement. Right. But I'm not saying the competitions are unfair, but I'm saying it's, and it's good that there are multiple judges, but it's not always as black and white as the results make it look.
Right, because there's a whole interpretation part, and there's that performance, that intensity that you were talking about that really can't be quantified, honestly.
Yeah. And again, it's that balance between precision and then and energy. In a college audition, hopefully both are very strong. If it's a younger students in a competition, there might be some students who play absolutely so-called flawlessly. I have issues with the idea of perfection. I'm not sure if perfection is possible in art, but maybe someone will play note perfectly, but someone else comes and plays, and it's a much deeper musical experience, and it's hard to balance those two things as a judge. If it's a younger student and they're really playing musically, and maybe slightly rough around the edges, maybe slightly, I personally tend to reward that more. I say, wow, this person's got a lot to say and they should be encouraged. It's not easy to play note perfect, but sometimes in music you hear something performed and you have the sense that they played it 999 times on their own, and this was the 1,000th time, and it sounded just like the other 999. And some of that energy, or again, that kind of initial love of what drew them to the piece, has been almost sanded out in the polishing process, and that's not good either. But again, it's no small feat to go up and play something note perfect in front of a high pressure situation.
I love what you said about the person having something to say. Do you want to talk more about that? Like, how can you tell? I mean, I just love that. I think it's so poetic, but I can just imagine some of my students looking at me and saying, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah,
what do you mean?
You said some key words, and again, in a college audition, someone's been preparing for their whole life, and they just get a handful of minutes to show that. I always make a number of small notes to myself, just kind of general observations about their playing. And one of the things I always write, or at least hopefully write, is these initials, NTS or STS. STS is something to say, like, this is a musical person. They have a charisma, either through their body language, through their choices and dynamics, something that really projects off the stage. Unfortunately, sometimes I write NTS, nothing to say.
Oh,
and that's a hard indictment. But again, you see kind of a 10-minute window of someone's experience. It's also important. Most recitals I play, the first 10 minutes I feel awkward, and then I get into it.
right,
It's
exactly.
really kind of it's. I wish there was more time. So they need to hit the ground running.
You have a new website for musicians and pianists specifically called Piano Think. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a growing project, and every week I put a couple of tutorials on piano playing, and they're common things that I talk about regularly with students, and they're probably for intermediate to advanced students. I've really enjoyed this project. I think it's helped focus my own teaching. It's also great that I can talk about something that I say, I made a video about this. Why don't you review that? It'll reinforce what we talked about. What I love about teaching is that it's one-on-one, and you develop close relationships with the students, and every student's a little bit different. But at the same time, the concepts and the principles are generally the same for each student, but maybe just presented differently or whatever that student needs at that time. And at the same time, teaching in a studio is kind of ephemeral in a way. I mean, you teach it and then it goes away, so to speak. Hopefully it lives on with that student. But I like that there's some permanency about this. And I've spent my whole life thinking about the piano and music making. So there's a kind of permanent aspect of this as long as YouTube sticks around.
Just so the listeners know, there are topics on everything. There's topics from octave playing to arpeggios, technique, and there's also a big section on performance anxiety, preparing for concerts. It's almost like a master class just at your fingertips. I really love that, and I'm going to be sending a lot of those to my students.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed making them.
Oh, good. So again, that website is pianothink.com. Do you want to tell us of any stories of any auditions that you have personally done, maybe when you were a kid or when you were in college? If you want to just give us a fun little insight into you.
Here was a meaningful one. I think, ultimately, when you prepare for an audition, you've got to be prepared. But there's a certain part of you that has to not really care at all. It's like, you're just there to make music and you don't care what happens. Look, I'm human. I've had auditions where I was so nervous and feeling underprepared and second guessing myself, and it didn't go well. And I've had auditions that went really, really well. One that was particularly meaningful. I was in the kind of competition circuit a lot in my teenage years, and then they grew more tense when I was older. I had made the final round of this competition in New York, and the first prize was a Carnegie Hall recital that was going to be sponsored by them. And the audition itself was at like 6:30. It was right at Lincoln Center where I was in school. And this audition, I set up a rehearsal on something completely different, like some chamber music piece. The rehearsal of which was going to end at like 6:10. Now, normally this would be terrible advice, but it put me in this very relaxed mindset as opposed to like, well, I'll get there at 5 o'clock, I'll warm up, and I'll be thinking, overthinking. I was ready to play, and I literally walked across the street, had about just a couple of minutes to warm up, and then played. And the audition went really well, and it was one of those great auditions where I had transcended the judges, and I was just kind of moved by the power of the music and felt just so connected to what I was doing without having to think about anybody else or judges or anything. It was just me letting my body do, and my brain knew what it knew how to do. It was magical, and I felt like I'd played my best, and it's a nice golden end of the story. I won first prize in that competition and got to play a recital at Carnegie Hall. My so-called New York debut. That was great, but it was a great learning experience, just in the sense of not getting in the way of yourself by thinking too much. And that the way I did that was by making sure I was thinking about other things right up to that moment, and then just going and playing and going for it, and not being so obsessive in my immediate preparation. Of course, obsessive in my long-term preparation, but just allowing myself to go and have fun.
All right. And that answers the question of how to get to Carnegie Hall. It's just that. Gotcha. Next time on Musicians versus the World.
Choosing the right repertoire is essential. Having something that's a little bit more original, I think, makes people stand out.
Where we'll finish up our conversation with Dr. Holden by discussing repertoire choices and teaching strategies to help our students prepare for high-pressure situations. Musicians versus the World is produced by Frosted Lens Entertainment in conjunction with Smith Sound Music. This episode was produced by Russ Wilkes and edited by myself. Special thanks to Dr. Scott Holden of Brigham Young University for his time and expertise in talking with us, as well as providing the beautiful music you've heard today. In case you're wondering, that was Franz Liszt's Sonata in B minor. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss out on any future conversations. If there's a topic that you would love to hear about, send us an email at info@frostedlens.com. We can also be found on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on our Musicians versus the World section of the Frosted Lens website. And that website is frostedlens.com. That's it. Thanks so much for listening. See you soon.